Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the Kursk region in the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. The Russians also managed to advance on the western bank of the Usk river line in the direction of Kupiansk. The Russians managed to regain some parts of the territory they lost during the Ukrainian counterattack in the Toretsk direction, and the Ukrainians have made several advances in the Chasiv Yar and Toretsk direction, where they threaten to encircle a significant portion of the Russian army. However, the Russians have sent 3 entire regiments to the city of Toretsk to counterattack the Ukrainian offensive and prevent a collapse of their northern front of the city of Toretsk. The Russians continue advancing northwest of Velika Novosilka, capturing an additional 8 square kilometers. Starting out in the city of Toretsk, this is where the most significant developments are taking place. The Ukrainians are continuing their offensive to regain control over the city. Their current push is an attempt to encircle the Russian forces in the northwestern outskirts of the city. The Ukrainians also managed to regain control over significant portions of the fortified positions on the western outskirts of the city. The Ukrainians regain control over the residential area in the northern parts, and they also managed to regain some positions and fortified positions here west of the city. The Ukrainians are here attempting to regain control over the Terikon in the western parts of the city to completely encircle the Russian forces in the western outskirts, and at the same time they're attempting to gain a foothold in the apartment complex areas in the central parts and eastern parts of the city to regain control of the central parts, which will allow them to push onwards to the eastern parts of the city. The Russians launched a counterattack to regain control over the apartment complex buildings near the stadium, and the Ukrainians also managed to gain a foothold in one of the apartment complex areas just outside the central defensive position of the Russians within the central parts of the city. However, the Russians managed to counterattack and push the Ukrainians away, and the Ukrainians are now located mainly through the Terikon Hills in the northern parts of the city, which they are using as their base of command for the operations into the city through the first patch in the west and the Terikon Hills in the north. With 3 regiments of the Russian armed forces being sent to the city, the Russians are preparing to counterattack as the Ukrainians double down on their offensive, hoping to gain some success in this area. The Russians will not be able to secure the city until they have full control over the fortified areas in the western outskirts of the city, the entire first patch area, as well as the 3 Terikon Hills in the northern parts of the city. At this point, the only thing preventing a Ukrainian encirclement of the western forces is the Terikon Hill in the western parts of the city. As long as the Russians hold that, they'll be able to keep their forces from being encircled. However, the Ukrainians are heavily pressuring the Russian forces in the western parts, attacking it from 3 separate directions, and this puts a heavy threat on the Russian positions within the city. What we're seeing is that the Russian offensive operations beyond the city of Toretsk has been significantly slowed down due to this Ukrainian offensive, and their positions in the western parts of the city are under heavy threat. However, the Russians have so far been able to defend their apartment complex buildings. This prevents the Ukrainians from gaining any significant foothold within the city. So right now, the main focus by the Russian and Ukrainian forces is the battle over the Terikon Hill in the central parts of the city and the apartment complex buildings. Whoever remain under control of that, as we see now the Russians, if the Ukrainians take control of it, they'll get an advantage. If the Russians hold on to that, then they'll keep the advantage over the battle of the city. We'll see extremely heavy battles taking place with thousands of soldiers fighting on each side. The Russians providing 3 regiments that could number up to 10,000 soldiers, and the Ukrainians similarly having a large concentration of forces to launch this offensive, and we see that heavy pressure is being put to gain control of it by the Ukrainians, and the Russians are trying to hold on. Zooming back out, we start in the northern direction where the Russians have managed to gain control over the area around Novaya Soroshina, where they are starting to move in the direction of Staraya Soroshina, here down along the Luknia river line. They've also managed to gain control over the first lines east of Novaya Soroshina, and alongside the railways they're moving down south towards Malaya Luknia. The Russians are here expanding their offensive operations to start attacking the 4 towns around Malaya Luknia and Malaya Luknia itself. where the objective is to close this pocket here in the northwestern parts of the Kursk incursion of the Ukrainians, as well as gain control over the Lubnia river line. This will allow the Russians to strengthen their positions in the northwestern flanks of Sucha and to start the battle over Sucha itself from the western flank. Moving on to the eastern direction near Kupiansk, the Russians have advanced alongside the Kursk river line to gain control of the remaining parts of Kalinove, as well as the forest patch to the south of it. This allows the Russians to get within close proximity to Holyobivka alongside the Kursk river line and Kindrashivka to the west. The Russians will here look to expand offensive operations towards the towns of Malashevkivka, Kindrashivka, and Holyobivka by fighting alongside the river line through the forest patches, alongside the forest lines here near Kalinove towards Kindrashivka from the east, along the main highway itself towards Kindrashivka from the north to gain control of the fortified position and start the battle over the town, and through the forest lines and forest patches to the north towards Malashevkivka to strengthen their western flank alongside the road towards Kupiansk. And we see the Russians are getting much closer to the city of Kupiansk in the western parts of the Kursk river line. Moving on further south to the city of Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians have made a counterattack in the northern parts to regain control of it, where their objective is to break the siege of the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city. At the same time, the Russians have made to advance in the southern flank, where they're moving on to the main residential area south of Chasiv Yar and onwards towards Mykolaiivka. The Russians are here looking to strengthen their siege and to gain control over the forest patch area and the residential area in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar, while the Ukrainians are here attempting to counterattack in the northern flank to free up their forces in the apartment complex area. Moving on to the direction of Velika Novosilka, we see here that the Russians have managed to gain control over 8 square kilometers of territory, as they managed to gain control over the southern parts of Toretsk, leaving only the northern residential area under Ukrainian control, as well as the forest lines nearby it. The Russians also managed to gain control over a fortified area north of Privilne and the entire town of Privilne, and they're now fighting over the fortified position north of Vilnepole as they continue their offensive operations towards Shevchenko in the northwest and the main defensive line in the northern direction. With this, the Russians have significantly improved their positions here northwest of Velika Novosilka, gaining control over a significant portion of the front line since the 10th of February. So an offensive has been ongoing for 18 days, and now we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations here to gain control over the surrounding towns and fortified positions. And the main push will now be coming from the eastern direction near Konstantinopel, as the Russian objective will be to bypass the main defensive line of the Ukrainians here remaining in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, as they move through Konstantinopel, Bahatir, Odradne towards Komar and beyond to cut off the Ukrainian positions. Throughout the front line, we see that the Russians continue having the initiative with the largest advances and most consistent advances being in their favor. However, we see that the Ukrainians have, with their new defensive tactics, started using more sustainable defensive maneuvers that are more aggressive, but this also diminishes their offensive capabilities. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are taking advantage of Russian weak points, launching larger counterattacks and using more forces in their counteroffensives near the front line, the local ones that take advantage of a gap in the Russian defenses, while at the same time this means that the Ukrainians would be expanding more forces for the defense. This would prevent them from launching another new offensive such as the Kursk incursion, but it also significantly improves their defensive capabilities. The Russians also made a massive mistake here in the direction of Toretsk to not gain control over the Terikon Hills on the outskirts of the city and not to gain control over a buffer zone around it, and at the same time to not properly secure the city with enough forces to consolidate their gains and build up their defensive positions. And this allowed the Ukrainians to take advantage of this to launch this surprise offensive, and it allowed them to regain significant portions of the city within a short amount of time. The Ukrainians do not have any decisive control over the city yet. They do not have any of the Terikon Hills within the central parts or the apartment complex buildings. However, they have a good potential to encircle a strong portion of the Russian forces in the western outskirts of the city and to negate many weeks of Russian advances due to this lapse in the Russian judgment with regards to the battle over the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.